Tony Montana is an iconic figure. Whether you've seen the 1983 film or not, you have seen Al Pacino's Montana one way or another in its undistinguishable black and white poster with its red-blooded font, or even had control over his avatar killing people while playing the video game under the same title. I would say that over the years, as new generations are introduced to Tony Montana and its bloody Miami, they know less about its significance to the times it was released to and the baggage we are going to unwrap in this video. Even though the film has taken other meanings to new generations over the years, I think it's important to place the film in the historical context of which it was released to, so misleading images don't just blurring with facts. It's also strange because when I think about Latina films or about Latino representation or misrepresentation, I never really think about Scarface. I mean, I should be incensed by it, but I never, when I see Al Pacino's Montana, think that fucking character. Maybe it was for the best that Montana wasn't played by a Latino himself, and if you stick around, you'll find out why. As always, let's go back in time first. 1932 saw the release of a film with the same title. The film became a blueprint for other gangster movies, inspired by Armitage Trail's novel of the same title, which Trails is based on the famous Al Capone. The film is about Tony, short for Antonio Camonte, and his rise to the top, killing everyone who gets on his way and cashing out big bucks through the Chicago's bootlegging market, which was the smuggling of alcohol during the Prohibition years. For a film of its era, the film didn't shy away from having immoral characters who used the most inhumane tactics to get what they wanted, which involved a lot of shooting and the obliteration of human lives. It was fucking violent for a pre-code era movie, and, like I said, it became a blueprint for Scorsese and other directors to replicate some of the action courses this film takes, like taking bullets before surrendering to the authorities, a mob flipping a coin, and just bringing Armageddon into an entire city only for the dominance and control over a money-making business or the grasp of a social structure in which everyone wants to be at the top. The film depicts Italians as undocumented criminals. In fact, in 1946, after World War II, Titanium, an Italian film production and distributing company, wanted to dub the film into Italian. The translation downplayed the film's Italian-American identity, changing the names into more American-sounding. Tony Camonte's name was altered to Tony Kermont, but the adapters went further to strip the film from its Italian identity. Carlo Maru getting rights for the Italian color, race, crime iconography, and dubbing conventions in the Italian versions of Scarface. Quote, the unmannered Tony, Paul Muni, storms in and out of a restaurant where his boss, Johnny Lobo, is dining and orders to the waiter partly in English and partly in Italian what looks like a big pasta dish. His comical lines were rewritten as follow. In the original, Tony says, "Hey boss, lots of garlic? Chadore, give me some too." The Italian says, "Hey boss, smells nice. Dark liver pate? Give me some too, I'm starving." But the dubbing went further, especially when it came to relating Italian to being undocumented. Perhaps they used the word illegal, which I always refuse to use, and it's politically incorrect to utilize anyways in today's context. There's a line that says, "These gangsters don't belong in this country. Half of them are not even citizens." The line is translated to, "Bosses and henchmen should be confined. These are repeat offenders, people who eradicate mercilessly." Muro Keating writes that this example references to gangsters as undocumented immigrants and to their relation to the Italian-American community were rewritten by means of generalization, which neutralizes the origins of criminals into "these are repeat offenders, people to eradicate mercilessly." You could imagine 1932 Scarface being the dessert of a full-course meal. The year before, 1931, saw the release of Little Caesar, the appetizer, and The Public Enemy, the entree. All films became influential in developing the gangster film genre. All films dealt with its own censorship issues. For Scarface, J. Eats Meat writes in the Historical Journal of Film, Radio, and Television, calling Scarface one of the most highly censored films in Hollywood history. Sympathy towards crime was in direct violation of the production code. Tony was deemed to be sympathetic, and the relationship of Tony with his sister was too out there, incestuous vibes, TBH. The Motion Pictures Producers and Distributors of America, MPPDA, wanted to delete the scene when Tony holds her in his arms after he slaps her and tears her dress. I mean, Howard Hughes, the dude DiCaprio played in The Aviator, and the director Howard Hawks had to use the scissors more than once to cut multiple violent scenes. MPPDA also demanded a prologue to be added to condemn gangsterism, and a new ending was crucial. Little Caesar and Public Enemy had to comply to such guidelines the year before, both inserting a foreword condemning the actions of the main characters and making it clear that crime never paid. Furthermore, the title Scarface had to go for something like Yellow or Shame of the Nation. The original script also had Tony's mother accepting her son's presence and loving him regardless of his body count. A Politician was also written to illustrate politics' double morality, campaigning against gangsters and rubbing shoulders with them behind closed doors. The ending is perhaps the most controversial and the epitome of Hollywood being Hollywood back then. Think conservative values, whatever. By the end of 1931, there were 3 versions of the film because censors just wouldn't agree on a final version. Cole Jason Joy was one of the people in charge of enforcing the production code for the Wingate of the Studio Relations Committee, SRC. And on June 3rd, Joy indicated concern over Camonte's heroic battle against police when spurred on by Proud Sister unquestionably tends to glorify a gangster who also, as underdog, wins sympathy of audience. The original ending of the 1932 film is very much like the 1983 one, except of course less sophisticated because, well, the 1930s. And a shorter ending, but essentially Tony shot several times after trying to escape. Such ending was considered glorifying, and it was a no-no for Tony to be seen above everyone else, even Law and Order, despite having died in the process. In the censor version, which is the one I saw sadly, Tony hands himself over to the police and the movie ends with him getting hanged, which we see it's oddly filmed since Paul Muni, the actor who played Tony, was not available for the reshoots, so you can see here it's all a body double with perfect angles planned for the scenes to fit the actor's absence. To make the censors happy though, Tony needed to die after having faced his crimes up in court and connect the consequences of his crimes, which in this case is capital punishment. Very plain inside, which is kind of patronizing. I mean, audiences are a lot smarter than that to make the connection. Or am I giving humanity too much credit? Joy wrote to Will Hayes, president of MPPDA, on July 23rd after meeting with Hawks and Durr, confident that Camonte would not end up a sympathetic character, the police will be heroic, and the mole will not be sexy, and so the censors got away with it. But I guess the story was never allowed to be told in the wild form Hughes and Hawks aspired to then. J.E. Smith writes in Revisioning Modern American History in the Age of Scarface 1932, the desire to capture and document the real aspects of Chicago and other post-war elements of American life grew as the public recognized the age impending of literation by the law. Capone's era was ending. Many of the more famous gangsters were dead, in jail, or in court. Smith writes about Little Caesar, operating under an increasingly repressive police and censorship system that will have attacked any attempt at a biographical glorification of a real gangster hero like Capone. The filmmakers obscure the historical details to suit their immediate needs. Yet this parallel manipulation does not fool the audience. The film Little Caesar offers a more complete view of the events to the audience that is denied to its participants and the censors. Rico is a version of Capone. He is real and has committed the robbery. Films like Public Enemy, Little Caesar, and Scarface wanted to tell the truth about the era of Al Capone's, not so much because it will make a popcorn entertaining film with shocking elements, but because it was the truth and the public deserved to know and form opinions about people like Capone. Whether he was a hero or not, it's up to the public to decide, but only if they have all the facts, no? Among Public Enemy, Caesar, and Scarface, one can say they all attempt to tell us something about the Prohibition era as perhaps a cautionary tale. 51 years after, there were talks about a remake. Now the word remake here makes some people scratch their heads, if I can put it that way. I mean, the plot is rather similar in terms of bone structure, but the choices for the 1983 film, one can say are highly superior. So we got Tony, same name, different surname, different ethnicity, even though in reality both Tonys were played by white men. In terms of plot, it begins with Tony being a nobody who wants to be somebody. He starts rising through the ranks of the business. Whether it's bootlegging or drug trafficking, in both films the dynamic is the same, the motive is the same. be rich and powerful. There is a boss with whom Tony first associates with and works for, and the boss in both films usually has something that interests Tony more than power and money, and that's a gal, Poppy or Elvira. In both films, Tony takes initiative to keep rising through the ranks and become his own boss at one point. Much to the dislike of Tony's boss, who wants him dead and attempts to have him killed, but Tony survives and kills his former boss, who denigrates himself like a coward, beseeching Tony to spare his life. Spare him he did not. Tony ends up with the boss's girl, and he weirdly resents and annihilates anything or anyone who dares to look or much worse hug or kiss his sister. I had to look this up and found some fan conjectures. While it's speculative what Tony feels for his sister in both films, he ends up killing his sister's love interest in the two versions and is wildly overprotective of her. Tony's feelings are never clarified, and so it leaves room for people to think that he is in love with his own sister. Even his sister Gina at the end of the 1983 film version says to him, "Fuck me, Tony. Come on, just fuck me." But I guess it would be simple and lazy of me to say that he loved her beyond a sibling form of affection. Jeremy Wadsworth for movie Scooby. Tony put Gina on a pedestal and could not accept that she could have needs, desires, and interests. Moreover, Tony saw women as objects, and therefore he could not bear seeing his sister with and ended up with guys like himself. Jeremy adds, Tony was afraid that Gina would end up with a guy like him, Manny. When Tony went to see Gina, he saw them together and assumed that Manny was having an affair with his sister behind his back, and in a fit of outrage, he killed his best friend, Manny. Tony thought Manny was an absolute jerk with women. Throughout Scarface, we saw Manny drooling over a woman and was not a marriage material guy. When Tony saw them together, he was convinced that Manny was corrupting the only pure thing in his world. Anyways, apologies for the digression so much on this, but the point is that no matter how different the 1983 version looks, it is still a remake, and much of its bone structure is a copy of the original. Which begs the question, why was it necessary to remake it? The origins of the 1983 Scarface are a little fussy, as there is more than one narrative available. The name Marty Bregman, a talent agent who transitioned from being Al Pacino's agent to produce major classics today such as Serpico and Dog Day Afternoon, both films starring Al Pacino and Sidney Lumet behind the direction. Anyway, this guy is said to be the person who first pitched the idea. Ultimately, Bregman did produce the film, but the tale goes that he stumbled upon the 1932 version late night and thought of Al Pacino and Lumet to be part of the talent. That version is sustained by the LA Times in 1983, which writes, Bregman conceived of the idea while watching the original on late night TV and instantly pictures Pacino in the lead role. But as I said, the origins are so clear, so there's really more than one version, really. In 2011, Al Pacino said during a Q&A that the idea was his, which came to him as he went to watch the original at the Tiffany Theater in Los Angeles. I went and saw the film and called Marty Bregman after. I think we could do this thing. There's a remake here. Anyway, whatever happened before that, we do know that Bregman picked up the phone and dialed the devil himself, Oliver Stone's number. Stone didn't want to be part of the making of yet another Italian mafia movie, as the book The Oliver Stone Experience reveals. Lumet, though, said it would be interesting to do the film as a Marielito picture in Miami.
And we embarked on this venture, this quest, to explore the cocaine world.
He came to me after the failure of my picture I directed called The Hand, and wanted my services back as a writer. And I needed money, and I was in a tough place. I was leaving America, and he said he wanted to do Scarface. I said, I'm not really interested in remakes, you know. It was not until Sidney Lumet came into the picture, I think shortly thereafter, we had another conversation, and he told me that Sidney Lumet was very anxious to do the movie and wanted to do it Cuban, Miami, 1980, 81, the Mariel boat lift to Miami.
Stone writes in his book Chasing the Light, Writing, Directing, and Surviving Platoon, Midnight Express, Scarface, Salvador, and the Movie Game, quote, another Italian mob movie after the two Godfather films and The Imitators has satiated any desire to compete. Although just to fuck with the fussy origins of the remake, Stone writes in his book that Bregman called him and said, "Now was Oliver, you ever seen Scarface with Paul Muni? I saw it the other night and thinks it's sensational. He thinks he can do it. And you know how impossible he can be." This was for him. All we need is a screenplay.
All of the films that I have made with Al, I have created for him, specifically for him, specifically for the things that I thought he could do best playing. I have a long and an old relationship with Pacino. I represented him when he first started. So I have a great knowledge of his instrument, which helped me in Scarface and the other films I made with him.
This is when I have to tell you about the Marielitos. The rabbit hole digs deeper. So the story goes that between April 20th and September 26th of 1980, roughly 125,000 new Cuban exiles departed the port of Mariel for the shores of Florida. And this is what the 1983 film version explains way before we see the first shot of the movie, telling the audience that, quote, in May 1980, Fidel Castro opened the harbor at Mariel, Cuba, with the apparent intention of letting some of his people join their relatives in the United States. Within 72 hours, 3,000 US boats were headed for Cuba. It soon became evident that Castro was forcing the boats' owners to carry back with them not only their relatives, but the dregs of his jails. Of the 125,000 refugees that landed in Florida, an estimated 25,000 had criminal records. Bolter writes, about a fifth of the Marielitos were rumored to be undesirable, petty thieves, and wars, released from Cuban prisons and mental institutions and sent to the States as a middle finger from Castro, which is what I just read, and the 1983 film version let us know at the beginning. The Mariel mass migration began when more than 10,000 Cubans asked for political asylum and were let inside the Peruvian embassy in Havana. Castro allowed anyone who wished to leave to immigrate to the US freely through the port of Mariel. Some reunited with family members, while more than half of the 125,000 were detained temporarily, something we sort of see in the film. Montana even needs to murder a Cuban general in order to get his green card and leave detention. Not sure how realistic this part is, but 60% of these Cubans were held in detention camps until December of 1980. They didn't want them out there in society, but they also could not send them back. Cuba didn't have an agreement with the US to be able to deport all the Marielitos coming. In Marielitos 10 years later, the Scarface legacy, it says that roughly half of the Marielitos were temporarily detained at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida, Fort Chapel, Arkansas, Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania, and Fort McCoy, Wisconsin. This was a new procedure that the 1980s Cuban migration brought. Before that, pre-Mariel, the US wanted to weaken communism and its preachers, which included Cuba. Cubans fleeing Castro were living proof of the social, political, and economic failures of the first communist society in the Western Hemisphere, so they welcomed them with open arms. According to Aguirre Science and Sinclair James, we need to take into consideration that the Cuban authorities never share any court records, medical documents, or any other information for that matter about any of the inmates they ship away to US soil. Often the people quote-unquote undesirable bribe officials to obtain a document called Drex letters or cartas de escoria, which served to corroborate that the person who was given one of those letters had moral blemishes, and it was in the interest of the Cuban government to get rid of this deviance. I mean, the person could be a homosexual, and that automatically was a crime, which despite the many other oppressions the LGBTQ+ community experienced in the US, it was not a crime, much to the disappointment of the second worst president that the US has had. Although I guess the US did care to know these things, and this is seen at the beginning of the 1983 film where Tony is questioned about his entire background, what kind of work he did in Cuba, the whereabouts of his parents, his criminal and mental health records, his tattoo and whether he was an assassin. He has even asked whether he is a homosexual or if he enjoyed dressing up as a woman. Jillian Marie Jacqueline writes, not long after the first Cuban exiles arrived on US shores, national reports of suspected criminality and homosexuality among Marielitos hurt the refugees' image among local Wisconsin residents. This is because Wisconsin was one of the locations where the Marielitos camps existed. Yet the US couldn't do much with this information and they had to let everyone in, so it didn't matter if the person had a Drex letter, they were treated equally. Whereas in Cuba, any difference, any other religion or point of view that could alter the status quo, they want them out. Okay, fine, so they didn't want to do another Italian mafia film because the genre is so overcrowded and the stakes are high. But I personally still scratch my head asking myself why. Why did Tony Montana have to be Cuban? The choice to reassign ethnicity was perhaps a confluence of randomness and curiosity from everyone involved. I mean, if Stone decided to pen the script, it was for that Cuban/Latin American factor. He said it himself, he was not interested in telling a story that revolved around the Italian mafia. He later did a movie called Salvador about the civil war in El Salvador and a documentary about the left-leaning movements in the region. But I wouldn't trust a man who supported Hugo Chavez, calling him a grey man, and praising the Colombian FARC. Stone is usually considered anti-establishment, and I can see how he endorses communism, or at least he questions the capital system in which Tony finds himself. In the film, there is a scene where Tony is in this lavish, gold-leaf bathtub, and he's watching a commercial about a bank saying, "Here at Florida Security Trust, we've been putting your money to work for a better America. We've been around for 75 years. We'll be here tomorrow." Tony responds to the TV advertising saying, "Somebody ought to do something about this horse, charging me 10 points of my money and they're getting away with it. There's no laws anymore, anything goes." Then a few lines later, Tony adds, "You know what capitalism is? Getting fucked." Then a few lines later, on the same TV, an anchorman named Big Phillip says the following, which can't be heard in its fullness because Tony talks over it, but it's in the script and I imagine it's supposed to be subtext. The question is, how with a small law enforcement budget do you put a dent in an estimated $100 billion a year business? It seems at times all you can do is put your finger in the dike and pray, but now we're hearing voices that say that the only way we can solve the drug problem is the same way prohibition was solved. Not by allowing the substance, but by legalizing and taxing them. These voices say that would drive out the organized crime element. He pauses for a moment and then says, "I'm not one of those voices," to which Tony says, "What do you know? You never been right in your life, big baby. Guy never fucking tell the truth. It's the guys like him, the bankers and the politicians who want to keep the coke illegal so they can make more money and get the votes to fight the bad guys. They are the bad guys. They'll fuck anything for a buck." What's interesting about this scene is that it mentions prohibition and how alcohol was eventually legalized. And if you recall from earlier, the first Scarface from 1932 takes place during the Prohibition years. Tony built a fortune from, among other things, bootlegging. Now in the 1970s and 80s, cocaine and drugs was the new alcohol. President Nixon coined the term war on drugs when he held a press conference on June 18, 1971, saying that drug abuse was the public enemy number one. This included weed.
America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse.
But the movie alludes more on cocaine and its hefty price on human lives. It's what many people kill for, and it's what many politicians use as fodder for their political ambitions. It's what fucks many people up in exchange for a buck. Is this what the remake is trying to tell us? Stone does explain this decision a little more, writing in his book, Lumet in New York made it clear to me that what he was looking for in the film was its contemporary realism, its immigration and drug war issues, and its politics reaching up into the higher levels of the government. The Colombians, reportedly more ruthless than the others, were taking over the drug trade from the old pre-Castro Cuban gangs. The Jamaicans and Dominicans, with their connections in New York and Jersey, were tearing off a piece. A lot of blood was being shed, but this wasn't something the Italian mob could get a piece of. This was a new deal with new faces and new codes. In another blog, A Fistful of Film writes, "The film does make an interesting and respectable stab at critiquing capitalism. Tony's from out of a communist nation in Cuba and comes to America to be a capitalist. And through this, what we see is that through America's willingness to advertise itself as a paradise, through America's willingness to advertise capitalism as a savior to the rest of the world, not only does it hide the darker sides of what it takes to be a good capitalist, it means that it is telling everyone that what it means to be a good American, it is to be a criminal. To be a good capitalist, you have to not care about anyone else, not care about authority, and just care about money and wealth. It's not like this is an arc Tony has either. He comes to America knowing this, and he finishes the movie knowing this." When you are talking about a philosophy like capitalism, especially the American imperialist version, you are talking about a philosophy that is obsessed with taking over. A philosophy that is obsessed with the self and the projection of the self. Part of what is wrapped up in Stone's critique of capitalism as a global virus of an ideology is the idea of unregulated growth that is at the heart of Randian capitalism. It is the Randian idea of capitalism that Scarface really deals with. After all, if there were no regulations, which is what Rand wanted, then Montana would have been able to reign supreme and nobody could get him on any pesky drug charges. I'm not sure if I subscribe to any of this bullshit, but I can see how this film could have some influence from Ayn Rand. Stone said that 1983 Scarface had the 1930s spirit of the Great Depression, with its gangster born from poverty and desperation. In that spirit, Scarface in the early 80s featured an anti-hero gorging front and center on this American dream of materialism revealing in it. It'd be a social satire, if you will, imitating and mocking the American desire for wealth at any cost. It would precede my work on Wall Street and later Natural Born Killers, both of which depict mishap and offspring of capitalism run amok. If we zoom in a little bit, 1983 Scarface isn't trying to point fingers at anyone saying that Latino immigrants are all criminals. I think, and this is solely my opinion, Scarface is a character study about Tony Montana, a tale of rag to riches that warns us about the limits of greed when there's a lack of scruples. Let's remember that the 1932 version was conceived as a vehicle to tell the story of Al Capone, a man who, like Tony, went through the ranks of the Chicago Italian-American Mafia. The FBI writes, Johnny Torrio was a string gang leader. About 1920, at Torrio's invitation, Capone joined Torrio. The racket spawned by enactment of the Prohibition Amendment. Illegal brewing, distilling, and distribution of beer and liquor were viewed as growth industries. Colosimo was killed by... we don't really know? There are rumors about Al Capone, but since they're all dead, we can't really ask them, can we? Frankie Yell and Colosimo's former wife were also among the suspects of his murder. You've probably seen Colosimo's death reenacted in Boardwalk Empire, although the show took liberties when it came to suggesting that the murder was a Yell. It's the most likely version of the facts, but they're uncorroborated, so we can't really say he did it. The FBI writes, Torrio soon succeeded to full leadership of the gang with the violent demise of Big Jim Colosimo, and Capone gained experience and expertise as his strong right arm. In 1925, Capone became boss when Torrio, seriously wounded in an assassination attempt, surrendered control and retired to Brooklyn. In a way, it's all very similar to the 1932's film's plot. The death of Big Louis Castillo is loosely based on Colosimo's assassination. Colosimo had refused venturing into the bootlegging industry, and it is rumored that that was the reason the mafia was ready to say bye to the fella. The unconfirmed theory is that Yale killed Colosimo so Torrio and Capone could start making profits for the gang from bootlegging. In the film, Big Louie is killed by Tony after his friend and soon-to-be boss Johnny Lovell asked him to, who is Castillo's right hand. Lovell was inspired by Johnny Torrio, and Tony, as we know, was inspired by Al Capone. The film presents Castillo's murder as the beginning of Lovell and Camonte's involvement in bootlegging, similar to how it went down with the softy Colosimo in real life. J. E. Smith writes for Revisioning Modern American History in the Age of Scarface 1932 that the early scripts of Scarface revealed that the team of screenwriters used the historical names and sites, only occasionally altering the spelling. Colosimo became Colosimo, O'Banion became Bannon, Moran became Doran, and Capone became Camonte, although we know Colosimo later became Castillo and Bannon became O'Hara, adding, Scarface remains Scarface, and soon audiences recognize the high points of Capone's historic career, O'Donnell's and O'Banion's beer wars, the assassination of O'Banion and Weist, the fall of Torrio, and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But the unprecedented campaign by the censors to remove the historical aspects of the narrative also fell because of the national publicity and scorn it attracted in the press. The public read about the many attempts to dilute the Capone screen biography, and at the theaters associated Lovell with Torrio and Camonte with Capone with ease. The major national reviewers referred to Scarface as the Capone film, often quoting the historical allusions the censors had been at such pains to suppress. The 1983 film doesn't shy away from being a replica, a clone, what we all know as a remake, but that's also because it's able to stand on its own too, as the way it tells the same story is a vast 180, and the film does not waste any minute in acclimating to its time, incorporating aspects that the early 1980s was reckoning with, societal problems that pertain to the times and that were worth acknowledging and discussing. I mentioned before drugs and drug lords. The character of Alejandro Sosa, the Bolivian drug lord, was based on Roberto Suarez Gomez. Sosa is Bolivian and comes from a wealthy family. Dorian Lee Jackson writes in Narcotrafficking and Camba Identity in Homero Carvajo's Olivia, La Conspiración de los Viejos. The amount of money Suarez Gomez was able to circulate throughout the formal and informal economies in Bolivia, with emphasis on the eastern region, established him as one of the most important capitalists in the country in the last 100 years. In this sense, he is the model Beniano male, wealthy, land-owning, politically well-connected, white, and paternalistically benevolent. The man earned about 400 millions a year and was a key business partner to Pablo Escobar, who supplied cocaine to the Medellin cartel. Just to set an example of the kind of power this man had, insider writes, "It was in early 1982 and his oldest son had been arrested by agents from the US Drug Enforcement Agency DAA. Having tried everything he could to have his son free, the father decided to send a letter directly to the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. In the letter, he promised, in exchange for his son's liberty, to pay off Bolivia's entire foreign debt, $3.8 billion. Can you imagine having that much cash available to bail your criminal son? What is interesting about Suarez Gomez is that he's kind of forgotten. I have to be honest, prior to this video, I didn't know this man existed or that Sosa was based on a real person. In fact, in previous watchings of this film, I thought it was random that Stone had picked Bolivia out of all the countries in Latin America to place the movie's kingpin. Lee Jackson adds, Suarez Gomez is arguably one of the most important historical figures in the story of cocaine in Latin America, yet outside of Scarface, he has been absent in the popular narrative of the Bolivian drug trade. Yet at the time, the year before Scarface was filmed, 1981, System Minutes ran a report on him and it was fresh in the minds of Americans. Fast forward to today, we can learn from this film that a man of such stature and power once existed. I think one of the reasons we don't hear enough about Suarez Gomez is because he was a wealthy individual. He is elite, the 1%. There's no rag to riches story here the way Pablo Escobar's story popularized and became glorified over telenovelas, international series, merchandise. His name is literally synonym with cocaine and drug lords. He's kinda like the Al Capone of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. In fact, I think one of the reasons Stone decided not to write a character in a way that would resemble Escobar, a man who grew up poor and became filthy rich and powerful, was because this is someone else's rag to riches story, and it would make his Randian and anti-capitalist arguments feeble, contradict them, as Suarez Gomez, and therefore Sosa in Scarface, is the regulator. Remember our lesson from earlier? The Randian idea of capitalism is that there shouldn't be any regulations, but Sosa controls who gets to be at the top with him and who doesn't. He kills Omar and picks Tony to negotiate that first big deal. He tells him not to betray him, and when Tony disobeys him, Sosa kills him. He regulates who gets to participate in the game of capitalism. Suarez Gomez did the same. He aided Escobar become the drug lord he was known to be and financed Bolivia's 1980s coup d'etat to place a dictator, Luis Garcia Meza, as president, and of course, many died because he ordered it. Regulator. Lumet exited the project and Brian De Palma entered. According to the producer, our friend Breckman, Lumet wanted to make one kind of a movie and I wanted to make another.
When Sidney read the screenplay, he didn't quite like it. He felt it should take more of a political direction, and I thought that not only wouldn't work, it wasn't true.
He thought it was too violent and over the top and wasn't what he wanted to do, so he left the project, which was disappointing. And obviously I would have loved to have directed. I had directed The Hand and Seizure, but it was a big film with Pacino and they would not let me direct it.
I went out and looked for another director and ultimately found De Palma, who saw the film as I saw it, as Oliver had written it.
Production moved forward without Lumet, and the word spread around the media and the city of Miami itself, which set Latinas on fire, and not in a good way. During the summer of 1982, pre-production had already started in Miami with the establishment of an office in the city. Variety's August 4, 1982 issue writes, spokesmen for Miami's Latin community are reportedly nervous at the potential bad image that could result from the movie Scarface, now heading into production. Columnist Guillermo Martinez penned an editorial voicing their main concern, that the stories of the Marielitos were fueling anti-Cuban sentiment in Florida.
I think it's a good picture for the Cuban people and the other person is living in Miami. It's a good picture.
Others agree with Perez that the image of the Cuban community might be damaged by Pacino's portrayal.
It's not right. It's not right to get refugees and put them on TV, on movies.
I don't like. I tell him it's better not put that kind of people. The picture.
Not here in Miami.
Not here.
Which will be further amplified by a film that would tell the nation and the world that the prototype of the US gangster of the 1980s was a Marielito refugee. In a New York Daily News editorial following the film's release, Miguel Perez charged, "The movie fails to say that even among those Marielitos who had criminal records, there were thousands whose offenses were so minor that they would not be considered criminals here, and thousands of others whose criminal record was based on their opposition to the communist regime." Variety wrote then that the picture was expected to pump $10 million into the local economy of Miami, as it was expected to be filmed in its entirety in the city. Bregman lamented in 1983 not having been able to contribute to the city's economy. He even wanted to invest in a nightclub there. Production ended up shooting in Miami for 10 days, all exterior shots, and then moved to California. Stone writes in his book about this time in the production of the film, "As I remember it, we were there less than 2 weeks before Cuban exile community leaders managed to get us thrown out of the city. First, they started the ridiculous rumor that Castro was financing the film, and when they got hold of a script, they wanted Tony Montana rewritten as a communist agent infiltrated into the US as a Marielito by Castro. Above all, they insisted we were distorting their so-called contributions to American society, which to my mind consisted of highly politicized anti-Castro radicalism that included financing various terrorist organizations, one of which blew a Cuban domestic airliner out of the sky, murdering some 80 people. No matter what dialogue we gave Pacino about hating the Castro regime, it didn't matter to this humorless and rigid right-wing group. Our hasty exit from Miami will make the film's already reckless image worse, but Bregman and Universal took a firm stand in positioning the departure as a planned retreat to the safety of the studio walls, and so they did. When the 1983 film came out, there wasn't much enthusiasm for it. It wasn't a critical or box office triumph. It ran second at the box office its first weekend. New York Magazine called it a sadly overblown B-movie. The Village Voice referred to it as camp for the coke crowd, but Scarface had a second life. Vulture writes that Scarface became one of the first runway hits of the home video age, shipping more than 100,000 units upon its initial release at $79.95 a pop, to add a robust $4 million to its coffers, and selling steadily on tape and disc in the following years. Its 2003 20th anniversary edition DVD, which followed a 10-city theatrical re-release, became the fastest-selling live-action catalog title of the format to date, moving 2 million units in its first week, outpacing previous champ E.T. Back in 1983, few would have believed that Scarface would best E.T. at anything. Yep. I don't like Al Pacino's performance here, or his accent for that matter, which makes me question even Brower's Cubanness, as he told the LA Times in 1983 that Pacino delivers perfectly accented speech and that his Cuban friends and family mentioned he looked believably Cuban. Suck up.
The group that we surrounded Pacino with in the film were all Cuban, basically all Cuban. Anytime that there was a problem in the accent, in Al's accent, they had the right to interfere and suggest that he was off with it.
You a communist? Huh? How'd you like it? They tell you all the time what to do, what to think, what to feel.
Robert Easton was a tremendous help to me with the dialect, and also the Cuban people who I met and spoke with, who gave me a lot of insights into some of the mannerisms and stuff, all of which I tried to put into a capsule and swallow and see what would come out. And I was trying more not to be as authentic, because I don't believe you can really be authentic unless you can mimic very well. But if I could take the accent and the mannerisms and sort of just heighten them in a way for this approach to this movie, because I think Brian De Palma was going to take a larger-than-life approach to this film, to conceptually deal with the movie in a more operatic style, just slightly larger than life.
But I don't think it's a bad performance if you see it in the context of fiction. It's sort of like a famous campy performance. Think Mommy Dearest or the Rocky Horror Picture Show that's part of our popular cultural vocabulary which people quote and imitate. An essay for Remezcla asked several Cuban Americans what they thought of the film. One of them says, "When Scarface came out, I thought at least they consider us hardcore badass drug dealers now. They fear us and they fear Miami." Someone else said that he remembers watching the movie when he was growing up in Miami, but once he moved to New York City for college, his opinion of the movie changed. His friends had Scarface posters on the wall, and their favorite thing to do was to quote Tony Montana using this shitty accent. Someone else says, "I've seen people get tattoos. I've seen people get phased with Tony Montana," said Hilo Navia, a video projectionist who grew up in Miami, said. "From what I talked to people about, they're not offended. They're proud Pacino played a Cuban guy," he said. "Every pizza shop in Miami has a poster up on the wall. I like to joke that no one in Miami talked like Tony Montana until after Scarface." He said that there's at least one big screening of Scarface in Miami that sells out every year. The first Scarface wanted to tell the masses the story of Al Capone, but the gangster genre had a chokehold end, censorship, which some won back. The filmmakers then felt it was important not to forget the pain and havoc Capone and all the gangsters of his generation brought upon Chicago. Perhaps the truth is only effective if it's told unfiltered, telling us what really went down in the 1920s. The killings, the businesses, the unresolved mysteries, the bad and the good deeds. To this day, there are still lingering questions such as who killed Colosimo or who ordered the St. Valentine's Day massacre. I guess now it's just compelling history, but in the 1930s, it was still so fresh. I bet people were afraid another public enemy would take over another American city. And although Capone was sentenced in 1931, when Little Caesar and the Public Enemy came out, there were still many unanswered questions that perhaps someone should have been asking. And these movies, along with Scarface, the boldest of them all, were a reminder, a monument to a dark era in history that deserves to be remembered for its lessons. I think 1983 Scarface was the right vehicle to tell us a modern global tale about the situation with drugs, the war on drugs. And I don't think I can pick a side on this. I definitely have my own opinions about the whole war on drugs matter, but who cares? What I know is that drugs are the source of pain for many people. Whether that's addiction or greed, people have killed over a gram of what looks like white powder that blows someone's brains out. It sparks a feeling of ecstasy and euphoria, and people chase that because life is painful, and without it, pain returns. But it hooks you. Drugs can make the poorest man today the richest tomorrow, but also drugs can put many innocent people behind bars and further racial disparity. And I think the movie, despite its flaws, wants you to form an opinion on your own, and certainly there were many different opinions then and now. Stone writes in his book, "I saw the film for the first time in a packed theater on Broadway with a paying audience mostly Latino and Black, which gave the film street cred. And right there, I knew it was a better movie than the film crowd thought, and that it would last. I knew it from riding the New York subways, I knew it from hearing people talk on the street, I knew it from people who shouted back at the film, who repeat the lines and laugh on the playgrounds and in the parks. These people knew it in their gut. The war on drugs was bullshit from beginning to end, a fraud sending them to prison in massive numbers. These people knew that Tony Montana had a code of honor of his own, and as fucked up as he was true to his nature till the end. He was a free man. Despite the underlying tones and the takes that Stone might have added underneath. Above all, 1983 Scarface does what the 1932 version was not allowed to do, and that is not having to pick the moralistic side. Who's the good or bad is up to us to decide. Or not.